Hi, this video was originally released yesterday, but I've added some new images.
On the 4th of December 1893, near the banks of the Shangani River, in what is now Zimbabwe, a small British patrol, numbering less than 30 men, under the command of Major Allan Wilson, fought a desperate last stand against over 3,000 Matabele warriors. Despite fighting until their ammunition ran out and inflicting significant casualties on their attackers, the result was never in doubt. As the Matabele made their final charge, legend has it that the surviving men stood and sang the national anthem. It became the stuff of British imperial legend and became part of the identity of the white community in Rhodesia for the next 80 years. But what had brought them to this moment in history? This is the story of the last stand of Major Wilson and the Shangani Patrol. The last stand of the Shangani Patrol in 1893 took place in modern-day Zimbabwe during the European Scramble for Africa. The British South Africa Company, a private venture established by mining magnate Cecil Rhodes, had occupied Mashonaland in the east of what is now Zimbabwe in 1890. Establishing the capital at Fort Salisbury, later Salisbury and now Harare, the settlers spread out, claiming farmland and potential mining sites, as well as establishing a network of forts such as Fort Victoria and Tuli. To their west lay the kingdom of the Matabele, also called the Ndebele. They were originally Zulus, whose leader had fallen foul of Shaka Zulu and fled with his people into what later became the Transvaal. Shortly after their arrival, the Boers moved into the area, and after a series of battles, the Matabele once more were on the move, crossing the Limpopo River into the west of modern-day Zimbabwe. There they established a new kingdom, which, using their Zulu war tactics, terrorised their neighbours, especially the Shona people to their east. Whilst never conquering the area, the Matabele and their kings regarded the Shona or Mashona as vassals who could be raided at will. The arrival of Cecil Rhodes's white settlers in Mashonaland now created a problem for King Lobengula, the son of the founder of the Matabele kingdom. The king needed to continue his raids to solidify his own position in Matabele culture. And whilst Lobengula specifically warned his warriors not to harm the white settlers, the Shona, even those living on white farms, were fair game. Claiming that the Matabele no longer had a right to invade Mashonaland, the man that Cecil Rhodes had placed in charge of the territory, Dr. Leander Starr Jameson, declared war in October 1893. Two columns, one from Fort Salisbury and one from Fort Victoria, advanced into Lobengula's kingdom. The Salisbury column was commanded by Major Patrick Forbes. The Victoria column was commanded by Major Allan Wilson. And when the two columns converged, Forbes assumed overall command. Taken by surprise by the suddenness of Jameson's attack, and despite his numerical advantage, Lobengula didn't have time to adequately prepare his forces. What impedes he had at his disposal, he threw against the laggard invading column. Despite the fact that the king had a substantial store of rifles, his warriors attacked armed with their traditional spears and rawhide shields, very much like their Zulu cousins had done just over 10 years previously. Up against modern rifles and Maxim machine guns, the result was carnage. In two battles, over 2,000 Matabele warriors were mowed down. On the 4th of November, the invading column entered the Matabele capital at Bulawayo, now called Bulawayo. They found it burning, and King Lobengula gone. Whilst they had won two decisive victories and had occupied the charred remains of the capital, Dr. Jameson was concerned that a large Matabele army was still in the field, and their king was still at large, acting as a rallying point. He was convinced that if he could capture Lobengula travelling north in a small wagon train, the impis would surrender. And so on the 14th of November, Jameson decided to send a flying column in pursuit to capture the king. The column of just under 300 men, plus two Maxim machine guns and an artillery piece, was commanded by Major Patrick William Forbes, a former officer in the regular British Army. Born in Whitchurch, Shropshire in 1861, having attended the prestigious rugby school, he was commissioned in the 6th Inniskillen Dragoons in 1880. Emigrating to southern Africa, he'd been part of Cecil Rhodes's pioneer column that had occupied Mashonaland. At the outbreak of the war with the Matabele, he'd been placed in charge of the Salisbury column, formed of irregular settlers. Major Forbes was in complete contrast to the commander of the column from Fort Victoria and fellow member of the flying column, another major, by the name of Allan Wilson. 5 years older than Forbes, he had been born in Scotland and had started his working life as a bank clerk. Travelling to Cape Town in the 1870s, he joined the Cape Mounted Rifles, rising to the rank of sergeant, following his participation in several frontier campaigns. Tall, handsome, powerfully built, with huge ambitions and faiths in his own abilities, he was just the sort of settler that Cecil Rhodes wanted in his new colony. With his frontier experience, it was no surprise when he was appointed to lead the Fort Victoria column invading Matabeleland. While sharing the same rank as Forbes, unlike the former cavalry officer, Wilson had been given his rank by the British South Africa Company. And therein lay a problem. Forbes, with his Sandhurst training and regular army experience, believed himself to be a proper officer and soldier, unlike Wilson. Wilson, on the other hand, believed himself to be a more experienced Africa hand, an experienced tracker, fluent in Zulu, the sister language of the Matabele, and highly popular with his men. He considered Forbes hesitant and totally unsuited to fighting the Matabele. Also accompanying the flying column was an experienced Boer frontiersman, Piet Raaff. Raaff, from the Orange Free State, was 44 years old and had seen his first action against the Basotos when he was just 16. During the Anglo-Zulu War in 1879, he'd raised his own irregular unit, Raaff's Horse, also called Raaff's Transvaal Rangers, and had fought at the battles of Klaban, Kambula, and the final British victory at Ulundi. He'd gone on to serve the British during the First Anglo-Boer War and had narrowly avoided being executed as a traitor by the Boers. Despite only standing at 5 feet 4 inches tall, Raaff was, without a doubt, the most competent detachment commander available to Jameson, just not the most senior. Nevertheless, Jameson now instructed Forbes to seek out and listen to advice from the experienced Raaff before making any decisions to attack, which made some sort of sense, but publicly undermined Forbes' authority. And there was another problem inside the British flying column. Apart from the Bechuanaland border police, the column chasing King Lobengula consisted of volunteers. In other words, the norms of military discipline that Forbes was used to were to a large extent absent. The men, especially the 60 who'd come from Fort Victoria with Wilson and Raaff's irregulars, listened to and took a cue from their own leader's criticism of Forbes. Eventually, the behind-the-scenes criticism came to Forbes' ears, and he ordered a general parade. He invited all those who were dissatisfied to take one step forward. All but 6 men stepped forward. With dissension in the ranks and the weather deteriorating and his wagons getting bogged down in the mud, Forbes decided to send half his men, his artillery piece, and all the wagons back to Bulawayo. Drawing 12 days' rations, he now pressed on. To aid their pursuit of the fleeing Matabele king, Jameson had provided Forbes with 2 American scouts, Pearl Pete Ingram and Frederick Burnham. Born in Minnesota in 1861, Burnham had been raised on the American frontier, where he became an expert in tracking, wilderness survival, and marksmanship, participating in the Apache Wars. For such an experienced scout, the task of following the tracks left by Lobengula's 7 wagons was initially easy. But soon, due to the weather and also some 50,000 cattle that were being driven along behind the king, the trail started to become more confusing. Whilst there was no sign of Lobengula, Burnham did spot the tracks of warriors who, rather than heading towards Bulawayo to surrender, seemed to be travelling in the same direction as their king. Peter Raaff shared that concern, noting that they were also being shadowed by Matabele warriors. Both the American and the Boer were right to be concerned. The Matabele warriors were indeed being mustered to defend their king by their most senior general, Mjan. In his early 50s, with a lifetime of military experience, Mjan had witnessed the carnage of the Maxim guns as the Matabele had charged over the open ground at the recent battles. Next time they met, he decided, they would use the terrain to their advantage. They would also use the several thousand rifles that Lobengula had accrued, ironically largely supplied by Rhodes to soften his seizure of Mashonaland. But even at this stage, the forthcoming drama could have been avoided. The king sent 2 of his trusted indunas towards Forbes' column. Each man carried a bag containing 1,000 gold sovereigns, and a note that read, "White men, I am conquered. Take this and go back." The Induners accosted two men riding about 100 yards behind the column, James Wilson, originally from Dartmouth in Devon, and William Daniel, a native of the Cape Colony. They handed the bags over, and believing that they had conveyed their king's wishes for peace, slipped off into the undergrowth. However, the two troopers destroyed the note, kept the gold, and more importantly, kept their mouths shut. If that peace offering had reached Forbes, the ensuing disaster might very well have been avoided. However, ignorant of those overtures, the column's commander continued his pursuit. Forbes was now convinced that they were closing in. However, he was actually riding into a trap. Umjam was going to use his king as bait and lure them across the Shangani River. Once on the other side, he would surround them and attack. He placed one of the king's wagons on the south bank of the river and set it on fire, giving the impression that the king was in desperate flight. He also placed a young herd boy close by, with instructions to be captured. At about 3 p.m. on the 3rd of December, the column reached the southern bank of the Shangani River and found the remains of the wagon still smouldering. As planned, the young cattle herder was spotted, detained, and delivered to Raaff, who questioned him in Zulu. The boy said that the king, accompanied by less than 100 supporters, had only recently crossed the river. When questioned about the warriors, he told them that the warriors were moving to the east. Raaff was sceptical about his information. It all seemed a little bit too good to be true. But Forbes was willing to give him the benefit of the doubt. Maybe he just wanted to hear what he wanted to hear. He resolved to fortify his position on the south bank, and then in the morning cross the river and in a lightning raid, commanded by himself, capture the king. It was now that Major Wilson offered an alternative plan. With what remained of daylight, he offered to cross the river and mount a brief reconnaissance to establish the exact whereabouts of the Matabele king, so that Forbes's raid in the morning would proceed with pinpoint accuracy. Obviously, he went on, if the opportunity arose, he would seize the monarch and bring him back. Forbes agreed, on the condition that whatever happened, Wilson should return by nightfall. It was now that the mutual distrust at the top of the command structure resulted in a fatal decision. Wilson heard a rumour that once he returned that evening, Forbes would place him, along with Raaff, in charge of the camp, whilst he would cross the river in the morning, seize the king, and claim the glory. There was no way Wilson was going to meekly stand aside and let that happen. He determined to capture the king himself, and if he couldn't do it this afternoon, he would camp overnight on the far bank and wait for Forbes to join him in the morning. Come hook or by crook, he was going to be where history was going to be made. Late in the afternoon, on the 3rd of December 1893, Wilson led a patrol of 12 men across the river. They were joined by the two American scouts, Burnham and Ingram. Each man in the patrol had 100 rounds and 3 days' half rations. And critically, as this was just a scouting patrol, they were not supplied with either of the column's Maxim machine guns. As he watched them depart, Raaff, guessing at Wilson's plans, was heard to mutter that not one of the damn fools would return alive. The departure and crossing of the river by Wilson was also watched by Matabele's scouts, who relayed the information to their general. There was about another hour and a half of useful daylight. Wilson's men were highly optimistic that in that time they would not just locate Lobengula, but capture him as well. Wilson surprised a group of warriors and forced a youth to lead him in the direction of the king. The youth trotted in front of them for 4 to 5 miles, taking them into the ever-increasing gloom of a forest. Around them, Burnham noticed campfires, a lot more than 100 supporters needed. Suddenly, in the last light of day, the canvas of Lobengula's wagons came into view, and beyond them, the patrol could make out a hastily built kraal. They had found the Matabele king. But now in the African darkness, and with all those flickering fires around them, Wilson decided that it was too risky to seize Lobengula and get back to the river in one piece. Already he'd lost 3 of his men in the inky darkness. He retired a couple of miles back towards the river and hid until morning. Back in his camp, Forbes was getting more and more worried. and also angry. Why had Wilson not returned by nightfall? Meanwhile, Wilson and his men were being soaked to the skin in a rainstorm, and as the rain continued, they could hear the waters of the Shangani River beginning to rage. But there was something else too, something a lot more troubling. They could feel the soft vibrations of hundreds, if not thousands, of feet nearby, and they could hear whispers of many, many voices. Rather than a handful of warriors protecting him, Lobengula, in his makeshift kraal at the wagons, was surrounded by possibly up to 5,000 fighting men. With his scouting skills, Burnham detected that far from setting up a defensive line in front of their king, the Matabele army were moving behind the patrol, cutting it off from the river. With this information, Wilson decided to send Captain William Napier, a Canadian named Robert Bain, and Trooper Robinson back to Forbes to request support, especially at least one of the Maxim guns. Having forded the rising river with difficulty, Napier reached Forbes and relayed Wilson's request to mobilise the whole force immediately. Forbes, a product of Sandhurst structure and protocols, was furious that Wilson had both not returned by nightfall and was now having the audacity to tell him what to do. Aware, thanks to those messengers, that there was a considerable Matabele force on the other side of the river, and noting the rising river level itself, Forbes was not keen on a river crossing at night, and was even less keen on conducting a noisy advance on the other side in pitch black. There also seemed to be a gathering force of Matabele warriors on his side of the river. There was every possibility that he would be attacked, possibly as they even tried to cross the river. All of which were prudent considerations. So based upon that, the next sensible decision would be to order Wilson to abandon his position and return to the camp while he could. What Forbes proceeded to do was the worst of all worlds. He sent Captain Henry Borrow with 21 mounted men to reinforce Wilson. Just before dawn, the party slipped out of his camp and headed across the river. Forbes chose not to send a Maxim gun. Quite what he expected an extra 20 men to achieve against 5,000 Matabele warriors is anyone's guess. But, just like Lord Chelmsford at Isandlwana, but on a much smaller scale, he had divided his force in enemy territory. The end result would be the same. The mood amongst Wilson's men when these meagre reinforcements arrived was pessimistic. The only good news was that the 3 men who had got lost earlier had managed to be reunited with the patrol, drawn in by Burnham, making wild animal cries. Cries, incidentally, which disconcerted the surrounding Matabele. Captain Freddie Fitzgerald urged Wilson to fall back on the river. The recently arrived Captain Borrow agreed. Major Allan Wilson, however, decided on a different plan of action. Surrounded by the enemy, cut off from reinforcement by a raging river, they were outnumbered, 30 men versus up to 5,000. He knew that there was little chance that they could escape. If they were going down, then Wilson determined they were going at a cost. He would take the king's best regiments and the king himself with them. It says a lot about the force of Wilson's personality that he was able to convince his whole volunteer command to carry out his plan. As the dawn broke, his small force cantered through the forest to Lobengula's wagons. With a mixture of supreme confidence and bravado, he called out to the king to surrender. He was met with a complete silence. Suddenly, a volley of shots rang out from the direction of the wagons. This was followed by more shots from the undergrowth surrounding them. Hundreds of warriors rose, some firing Martini Henry rifles, others armed with their traditional assegais. The patrol now fought a brief rearguard, falling back and forming a defensive position around a 20-foot-high termite mound. With his own casualties mounting from the accurate fire from the white soldiers, the Matabele general, Umjan, ordered his warriors to withdraw into the surrounding trees and bush and whittle down the British defenders with sniper fire. Initially, rather like the Zulus, the Matabele fire was inaccurate as they'd set their rifle sights too high, but with both modification and the sheer volume of fire, they started to hit Wilson's men. It was now obvious that Wilson's men would not get out alive unless they mounted a desperate charge, but with a dwindling number of horses, most of whom were exhausted, it was unlikely to succeed, and they'd have to leave their wounded behind. It was now about 8 a.m, and he decided to send the two scouts, Burnham and Ingram, back to the column, counting on their scouting skills to get them through the ever-tightening Matabele stranglehold. They were to tell Forbes that they'd located Lubangula but were surrounded by the enemy and cut off by the fast-flowing river. Nevertheless, the message went on, they would do their best. Wilson knew they weren't getting out alive. The two Americans and an Australian trooper by the name of Gooding spurred their horses out of the clearing. Catching the Matabele by surprise, they rode through a regiment that was moving into position and sped towards the river. Behind them, Burnham could hear more firing from Wilson's position. Eventually they reached the river. Yesterday it had been 6 inches deep and 20 yards wide. Now it was a churning, dirty torrent, inflated to a width of 200 yards. Keeping their bandoliers above their heads and holding on to their horses, they plunged into the water. They arrived at Forbes's camp to find that it too was under ferocious sniper fire. Any attempt to ride across the swollen Shangani River to rescue Wilson had disappeared. Meanwhile, Wilson was preparing his last stand. The remaining 29 men formed a ring with their horses, which they shot to form a wall. By doing so, they had accepted there was no escape, and they were going down together. His patrol fought on. The Matabele claimed that one defender, despite being disabled in both arms from injuries, dragged bandoliers with his teeth so that comrades could fire away. There is some confusion as to how long the fighting lasted. With no European survivors, the only witness statements came from the Matabele warriors, and their accounts are conflicting. What they all agree on is that Wilson's men held out until at least midday, if not into the afternoon. They claimed that Wilson, who they identified by his moustache and red puggaree that he wore around his hat, was shot 6 times, but fought on with wounded comrades handing ammunition to him. Afterwards, Umjan said that the Matabele was so impressed by the defenders that he actually offered to spare one of them so they could tell their story, but Wilson's men responded that they would live and die together. An Induna by the name of Nityana reported that when their bullets finally ran out, 7 men were still standing. They shook hands and sang a hymn before the Matabele moved in to finish them off. Another Matabele veteran also confirmed that the defenders sang a hymn, having taken their hats off. He said that the Matabele actually ceased firing for that moment, thinking that it was some form of witchcraft. Legend has it that the men sang God Save the Queen. It was just the sort of stirring story that the British public and Rhodesian settlers wanted to hear. However, others, based on Matabele reports, claim it was the hymn Abide With Me. Whatever was sung, the end had come. The Matabele surged forward with their assegais to finish the patrol off. They claimed that Wilson was the last man to die, and maybe he was. But then, many a Hollywood film ends with the key enemy leader being the last man to die. Maybe the Matabele storytelling was similar. We'll never know. But what we do know is that Umjan ordered his warriors not to cut open Wilson's dead men, as was their Zulu inherited custom. He shouted to his men, "Do not touch their bodies. They were men of men, and their fathers were men before them." His men had been victorious, and they'd successfully defended their king. Whilst exact figures were never established, Matabele losses were reported as substantial. A surviving Induna, Sivalo Malana, gave one of the most detailed accounts regarding casualties. He said, "So all the white men died, with a great number of Matabele. In the afternoon, the Matabele picked out their dead to bury them, and on the morrow they did likewise." To spend that amount of time burying their dead would suggest a casualty figure in the hundreds. Historians suggest at least 300. On top of that figure, there would have been at least a similar number wounded, possibly more. The 29 dead members of the Shangani Patrol had cost the Matabele dearly. Apart from his losses, it had also not been quite the victory that Umjan had been hoping for. The majority of Forbes' column had not walked into his trap. They were stuck on the far side of the river, and whilst under sniper fire, they were able to fall back, using the Shangani River to protect their flank. For the next 10 days, they conducted a fighting retreat, enduring 8 Matabele attacks, which only ended when a relief column escorted them back into Bulawayo. There, Forbes was shunned by the settlers and incurred the condemnation of Cecil Rhodes. His actions at the Shangani would stain his reputation rather like Major Reno's at the Little Bighorn. However, if Forbes had crossed the river, it's debatable if the outcome would have been any different. Writing later, Burnham grudgingly admitted just that. The last stand of the Shangani Patrol was the last significant action of the First Matabele War. Lobengula died shortly afterwards, possibly from a broken heart, possibly from smallpox, and possibly by taking poison. Without their leader, the Matabele resistance fizzled out, for the time being. Rhodes and his British South Africa Company added Matabeleland to their dominions. Along with Mashonaland, it was formed into a new country, named after its founder, Rhodesia. The descendants of the white settlers would rule Rhodesia until 1980, when black majority rule was established and the country adopted its current name of Zimbabwe. Now, I've been asked by a growing number of viewers to cover the Matabele and Mashona uprisings later in the 1890s, and also the Rhodesian Bush War in the 1970s, so I will get round to them at some stage. I also intend to cover the life and legacy of Cecil Rhodes, so watch this space and, better still, subscribe to my channel so you don't miss them. Despite being held responsible by many, including Rhodes, for the death of Wilson and his patrol, Major Patrick Forbes nevertheless went on to become a British South Africa Company administrator in what is now Zambia. He was also instrumental in the foundation of the Legion of Frontiersmen. Many of its members went on to serve in a special unit nicknamed the Old and the Bold that fought in East Africa in World War I. Forbes, however, was too ill to participate in that particular adventure. During that conflict, he served his country by commanding a POW camp in Wiltshire. He died in England in 1923. Frederick Burnham would remain in Africa, serving in Rhodesia during the later uprisings by the Matabele and the Mashona, before participating in the Boer War. He played a leading role in the establishment of the Boy Scouts, and was a member of the Canadian division of the Legion of Frontiersmen. After a colourful career, he died in California in 1947, aged 86. The actions of James Wilson and William Daniel in reappropriating the gold that Lobengula had sent as a peace offering might have remained a secret had they not gambled with their new gold sovereigns in the camp. They were sentenced to 14 years imprisonment, but released on a technicality and disappeared from history. The bodies of Wilson and his men were later interred close to Cecil Rhodes' own grave in the Matopo Hills outside Bulawayo. Wilson's last stand with his Shangani Patrol became part of the white identity in Rhodesia for over 80 years, until the establishment of Zimbabwe. At the time, the British press portrayed them as martyrs and heroes, brave, stoical, loyal to their comrades, and singing the national anthem as they met their doom. True sons of the British Empire at its zenith. Well, I hope you enjoyed that story from the 19th century British Empire in Africa. A big shout out to Derek Gordon, Ruben Sher and Simon Parks for joining my members channel here on YouTube. Details of all the ways you can support me are in the description below. Thanks for joining me today. Keep well, and I look forward to sharing more stories from British history with you very soon.